Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this week's video, we're going to talk about choosing a dot size for an RDS handgun. The red dot sight for handguns is becoming more and more prevalent. It is the way of the future. It's where we're going. You look at where rifles came from, and there was a great period of controversy on whether they're going to be dependable for duty use, for self-defense use, for military use. And that argument's pretty much been put to bed. And the argument with the handgun RDS is starting to go the same way, and luckily a little bit quicker, because unlike the debate that happened with the rifle, that took place in a time where social media, the internet wasn't really a thing. You didn't have such a great access to information. You kind of had to just go with what you read in gun magazines, or what you were able to talk within your own circle of people who had hands-on experience, be they military, law enforcement, hobby shooters, self-defense shooters, so on and so forth. Or, you know, in the early days of the internet, the forums. Now there's a great deal of access of information when it comes to the reliability, the known reliability, which products work, which products don't work. And as long as we remain objective about our choices, we can make a mistake or two or three or have a couple of bad purchases, but the overall arc of reliability on a certain product, a certain RDS that you're going to choose, there's really good objective information out there. So choosing a brand, kind of a different topic. I am very pro Trijicon when it comes to my micro red dot sights. I use the RMR exclusively. I've tried others. I see others come through classes consistently, so it's not a bias, it's an objective opinion, because a bias is prejudicial. And this is based on my own personal experience, my professional experience, and just the fact that my sample size is pretty large. Not as large as some, but larger than others. But that's kind of beside the point. So what we're going to be talking about is how to choose a dot size, because we'll use the RMR as an example. There are multiple dot size offered, all the way from 1 MOA to 12 MOA from Trijicon with the RMR line. So how do you choose your dot size relative to, you know, what you're putting on? In this case, we're talking about a handgun. The very first thing to understand when choosing a dot size, be it even for a rifle, but more specifically a handgun, is that dot size is going to be relative to the intended purpose of the handgun. What's the handgun's expected, if you will, envelope of range? You're not going to probably expect a handgun to be used in the same defensive or offensive role that you would expect out of a rifle. Rifles are generally able to reach out much further and get hits much more reliably with higher energy on delivery, if you will, than a handgun is. Handguns are generally considered close quarters weapons. Now, that bright line distance, how far do you expect to have to shoot with your handgun? Now, that's kind of a personal decision based on, you know, your occupation or your practice or your lifestyle or where you live or your occupation or any other number of factors. But there is kind of a most likely to least likely argument that can be made, and whereas you're probably going to use your handgun at a closer distance. So choosing your dot size is that has to be factored into your choice. Another thing that should be factored into your choice is the understanding what we're actually doing with a micro red dot sight. We're not looking at the dot, we're looking through the dot. We look at our target, we superimpose the dot over where we want to hit. Now, dot size matters there because the larger the dot, relatively speaking, to the distance or the size, small size of your desired point of impact, the dot can actually block. You can't physically see through the dot itself. It may actually block what you're trying to see. Now, occlusion comes into that. You're shooting with both eyes open, and that's another good reason to do that. And that allows you to gather the data that the dot itself may actually be blocking. But relatively speaking, the smaller the dot, the more of the target you're going to be able to see. The size of the target, of course, is completely dependent on what your desired point of aim is. Of course, that ability to focus on our target as opposed to focus on a front sight is why the red dot sight is so great, why red dot optics in general are so great. They allow for first focal plane or one focal plane shooting. We do not have to reconcile all these different focal planes in whatever time is available to us in order to deliver accurate and knowledgeable fire. So that factors into dot size as well. Is your dot too small? Is your dot too large? This can come into a very wide category of personal preference, but there are some things to consider that you're going to get from one size of a dot that you're not necessarily going to get as much of from another size of a dot. As already mentioned, there are multiple dot sizes available, especially from Trijicon, but the argument usually, as I see in my experience, comes down to two different sizes: the 3.25 MOA and the 6.5 MOA, and which one is the better choice. The 3.25 actually does seem to be more popular, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I'm going to do is go over the pros and cons to both sizes in respect to shooting them mounted on a handgun. So here's our target, our desired point of impact. Put two black contrasting dots on there, one for the high thoracic and one for the head. With the 325, one of the things that you're going to notice, probably more than you do with the 6.5, is the fact that your natural tremor, your natural movement in your hands translate more because the dot is smaller. This is even more, I could say, exaggerated if you were to use a 1 MOA dot, such as the 1 MOA RMR that Trijicon offers. As you can see, I'm able to keep it roughly steady right where I want it to be, no big deal. But the movement does translate, to my eye, much more significantly than, say, with the 6.5 MOA. Now here's our 6.5 MOA dot. You may not be able to see a significant difference based on the distance to the target and the fact that there are some limitations with actually filming this, because it doesn't see it quite like the human eye does. But generally speaking, it's not a big deal for me to be able to maintain my desired point of aim at this distance regardless of the dot size. Now once distance is increased, we're about 15 meters-ish now from our threat target. That natural sway, that natural movement is a little more evident on the 3.25, and it definitely, you can feel the more significant margin of error as we drift up here to our smaller point of aim, the head. Roughly staying in the thoracic cavity, not that big of a deal. If I really took my time, wouldn't be too hard to get those hits. But the fact that I only have 2 points of contact on the handgun versus 4 points of contact, 3 points of contact, depending on how you want to look at it, on the rifle, certainly translates to the gun. You definitely notice that movement more. Now bringing up the 6.5 dot, obviously it does cover more of our target, but I do feel like there's significantly much less movement translated or visible, exaggerated if you will, than with the 3.25. Now pushing it back to about 25 meters using the 3.25 dot. Still able to maintain good point of aim. Obviously there is, to my eye, a little bit more drift with the 3.25, comparing it to the 6.5. So I actually debated on whether or not to actually film that through the camera's perspective, because the camera just does not see the same way that the human eye does. Your due diligence, of course, is going to be to grab a 3.25 MOA RMR, or whatever your chosen red dot is. Grab a 6.5 if you want to. Grab a smaller one. Grab a larger one. I don't mean buy them all, but get out there where you can see them. If you go to a class, you're going to run into guys that have different dot sizes, and you can probably check them out. That's how I did it, starting out using the red dot. In fact, my first RMR was a non-adjustable LED 3.25, and it frustrated the hell out of me. My chosen dot size is 6.5 MOA. Is it a larger dot? Yes. It's roughly the same width, relatively speaking, as that front sight post with your average suppressor height sights that you're going to use for that potential need for co-witness on an RMR handgun. I like the 6.5 MOA dot. It does create more of a problem shooting at distance than the 3.25 MOA, but are you going to need to take that 100-meter handgun shot? Probably not. Yeah, the possibility's there. But it is less likely, and of course everything we talk about is anecdotal. We can't presuppose too much, because we get into trying to predict the future, and then we stack our equipment for a situation, and then something else may happen, and we're kind of left at a disadvantage because we presuppose something that we shouldn't have. So we try to keep our equipment and the way that we choose our gear as objective as possible. The biggest problem with the experiment is the laboratory is always different. And because the laboratory is always different, it's going to be very hard for anyone to definitively say this is the dot size that you should have because of this. So for me, the reason I use a 6.5 MOA dot is because it's roughly the same width as that front sight post. The average sight post that I've been using, yeah, I mean there is a difference in measurement. There is a slight difference, so it's not specifically the same width. But I'm so used to that width, if you will, that the 6.5 really kind of endeared itself to me once I started shooting. My first dot size was a 3.25 MOA LED, and it aggravated me because I feel like the 3.25 translates everything, or I should say exaggerates all movements of the gun far more than the 6.5 does. Your recoil, you're finding the dot on the initial draw stroke, just any general movement translated to the firearm, that dot just seems to move considerably more than the 6.5. Of course, it's probably moving the same, but since it's a larger object, it doesn't seem to the eye, translate as much. Is this getting into the minutia of choosing an optic size? Yes, it is, but you should get into the minutia of choosing your optic size or your dot size for your self-defense or your duty handgun. It's very, very important to make those decisions. When it comes to actual performance at distance, once we get back to those bright line distances of 25, 30, 45, 50, shooting steel at 100, the 3.25 MOA dot is really going to shine because it covers up less of what you're actually trying to hit. And remember what I said, unless you go super, super, super dim on your dot, you probably can't see through it. You just have to use occlusion, be able to see around it, collect that data using, stereo vision, both eyes open. But you're not actually able to see through the dot. You see what you focus on, what you want to hit. You superimpose the dot into your vision. You break your shot. If you're doing everything right, you're going to get a hit. The 3.25 is great for shooting steel at 100 meters, especially those really small plates. Impress your friends. That's awesome. But is that necessarily beneficial to me in the grand scheme of things? If you're just using an RMR for long distance pistol shooting, then the 3.25 or even the 1 MOA might be your choice. But if it's a gun that needs to do a bunch of different roles well, the 3.25 might not be the choice for you. Now, I'm not obviously advocating against it. Because all kinds of people, in fact, I'm pretty sure it is the most popular dot size, although I'd probably have to check with Trijicon or one of the other companies to see how many one size they sold versus how many of the other. But it definitely is the dot size that I run into the most. My personal opinion, since I've been asked about it so many times, I wanted to do this video, 6.5 MOA. Now that's my choice based on my experiences, the way I shoot. I'm still able to get those cool guy shots out to 100 meters on steel with my 6.5 MOA. It does fall off a little bit after that, depending on the size of the target. But when it comes to up-close shooting, especially under force on force, the one of the simunition guns I have has an RMR mounted on it. It's 6.5 MOA. I had a 3.25 on there for a while. Any student that came through a force on force class that normally carried an RMR, that was his gun for the class because I wanted him to train as close to what he actually carried. And what I found with the 3.25 versus the 6.5 is guys were having a little bit more trouble finding the dot across a wide degree of experiences. Some of the guys literally had just started carrying a red dot gun. Some have been carrying a red dot gun for a few years. And I don't have any scientific data, obviously, to back this up because, again, the laboratory and everything concerned, it was a very, very small sample size. So I won't say definitively that the dot size itself was a reason. It could have been other factors. But the 6.5 seemed to be easier to acquire under the stress of force on force than that 3.25 was. Now, this has literally just been a food for thought type of video when it comes to choosing your optic size. When it comes to choosing your optic itself, again, I'm very, very, very pro in the Trijicon camp because they make a very, very reliable product. Now, I generally don't do comparisons. But if someone were to ask me what red dot sight should I get, the Trijicon is going to be the one I recommend across the board. The only close second place is Leupold with the Delta Point. I do like the Delta Point. I like the Delta Point's dot sizes. I like the Delta Point's electronics. I like the Delta Point in general. I like the fact that you can access the battery panel without removing it from the gun and put a new battery in. I hate the size. I think it sits much too tall, forces me to use these crazy high suppressor sights, and that does affect my point of aim, point of impact variance on my suppressor sights if in the event that I needed to use sights over the dot itself. Not a huge deal, but it is a little aggravating to me. I like the fact that the RMR sits a little bit lower to the gun. And all things considered, the Delta Point didn't offer significant enough advantages for me to seriously consider getting rid of my RMRs and going with that. So that's one of my reasons of going with the Trijicon products. In choosing your dot size, again, get out there and find guys that have it. Find guys that have a dot size you want to do. See if you can put a couple hundred rounds behind it and make a decision. Because again, my decision, my dot size, my preferred dot size is 6.5 MOA may not be for you. Your eyesight may be different, mine, corrected vision, astigmatism, things like that. There may be other factors driving you to choose a smaller dot or even go with a larger dot size. The one thing that we do have to do is make sure that we make our decisions as objectively as possible so we don't end up spending twice or 3 times the money because we bought what everybody else is running without ever actually checking it out for ourselves to see if it worked for us. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.
And if you can't decide on RMR size, you can always use both.